Welcome to the first session of CMJ's Spring Bible Week. I'm Jane Moxon, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. It's often thought that science and religion don't mix, but our guest this week is a renowned scientist and a Christian, Professor Sir Colin Humphreys. He's Professor of Materials Science at Queen Mary University in London, Emeritus Goldsmiths Professor of Materials Science at the University of Cambridge, where he worked for 30 years, a Fellow of Selwyn College, Cambridge, and Honorary Fellow of Churchill College, Cambridge. He was knighted in 2010 for services to science. In 2011, Colin became a Fellow of the Royal Society. The Royal Society is a fellowship of many of the world's most eminent scientists and is the oldest scientific academy in continuous existence. He's also a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and he has many more awards. Colin likes science to have a practical application, and in the year 2000, he founded the Cambridge Centre for Gallium Nitride and set up two spin-off companies to exploit the research of his group on low-cost LEDs for home and office lighting. But what struck me is his engaging gift of being able to take hugely complex scientific concepts and make them simple. I suppose it's a bit like the way a transformer takes a high current of electricity and can bring the power down for important household items like my heated rollers, and other items like the toaster. In the same way, Colin is a bit like a transformer. His hobby is using his scientific training to answer some of the Bible's seeming contradictions and mysteries, and he brings to us answers in a most accessible way. Colin speaks to us now on Can we find the date of the crucifixion from clues in the Bible? Thank you, Colin.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Jane. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to be giving this first talk in Spring Bible Week 2025. And the title of this talk is, Can we find the date of the crucifixion from clues in the Bible? And so it's going to be a bit like a detective story where I pluck out clues from the Bible and present them to you, and you can see if you agree with them or not. And as we move on, we'll just home in on finding the exact date when Jesus was crucified. I got involved in this when my father gave my 8-year-old daughter a book called Great Men of History. I guess today it would be called Great People of History, but then it was called Great Men of History. And each page considered a great person like Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, or Jesus of Nazareth. And in the front of the book, it had an index where the different great people were all listed, but also listed were their dates of birth and death. And they all had definite dates of birth and death, except Jesus. And against Jesus, it said, born 4 BC, question mark, died AD 30, question mark. And my 8-year-old daughter looked at me and said, Daddy, how is it? We know when all these other famous people were born and when they died, but we don't know when Jesus was born and died. Does that mean he was real or a fictional character? And so I thought that this is a really good question, and that set me off on trying to find the date of the crucifixion. So why are the dates of Jesus uncertain? Well, that's actually easy to answer. So Jesus was born a pauper. How do we know this? Because the Old Testament book of Leviticus tells that every firstborn Jewish male had to be taken to the temple, and a sacrifice was offered of a lamb and a pigeon. But the Bible goes on to say, if the people were poor parents, they could offer just 2 pigeons or 2 doves. And then if we go to the New Testament, Luke tells us when Jesus was presented in a temple, this poor option was chosen. So we know from that Joseph and Mary were poor people. So Jesus was born into a poor family. And then Jesus died a common criminal. He was crucified by the Romans. We know from historical records they crucified over 2,000 people. And we also know that no records were kept of poor people or of common criminals at that time. You had to be a famous person to end up in Roman history books. So that's why we don't know the days of Jesus, the dates of Jesus. He was born a pauper, died a common criminal. No official bothered to write down the dates he was born and the dates he died. So, well, is it important to know the date of the crucifixion? Well, I think it is. And that's because our Christian faith is not based on some vague beliefs, but on real historical events. And the more we can date these events, the more we improve the historical basis of our faith. And it's also a matter of truth as well. And Jesus talked a lot about truth. And one of the things he said was, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And a key question we can ask is, are the words of Jesus recorded in the gospel true? And if they are, we should, of course, take them seriously. Are we going to discuss one of the most difficult contradictions, if it is a contradiction, in the gospels in this talk? So we're going to look at a lot of interesting and quite complex situations in this talk. So the last week of Jesus is arguably the most momentous week in the history of the world. Some people call it Passion Week, other people call it Holy Week. To the gospel writers, it was supremely important. So in terms of verses, 25% of Matthew's gospel is devoted to the last week of Jesus, 30% of Mark, 20% of Luke, and a massive 40% of John is devoted to the last week of Jesus. And I know of no other biography which devotes so much time to the last week of the person being written about. So supremely important, but also we have a huge amount of information in detail about the last week of Jesus in the Gospels. So can we know the year when Jesus died? So it's an outline of the talk. Then how do we account for apparent discrepancies in the Gospels about the last week of Jesus? Does our study of the Gospels in depth give us new insights into the life of Jesus? So let me start with some problems. So as I read the Gospels to try and answer the question my 8-year-old daughter had asked, I realized there were problems. As I said before, this is a detective story, our suggest-throughs, and you're the detectives. So this is the first problem. The question seems a simple question. Was the Last Supper a Passover meal or not? A very distinguished biblical scholar, some of you may have heard of, called F.F. Bruce, said this was the thorniest problem in the New Testament. And let me just outline it here and we'll come back to this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are often called the synoptic gospels because they're broadly similar. And they say very clearly the Last Supper was a Passover meal. John's gospel says, I think, equally clearly the Last Supper was before the Passover meal. And so this gives different dates for the Last Supper, and it therefore gives different dates for the crucifixion. And why this is very curious is whatever you think about biblical inspiration, the situation is Jewish people, I think, would never mistake whether a meal was a Passover meal or not. It was much more distinctive for Jewish people than Christmas dinner is for Christian people. You know, the Passover was a very, very distinctive meal. And there were witnesses there. So we know all 12 disciples were all at the Last Supper. So when people like Luke wrote his gospel and he said he consulted eyewitnesses, there were a lot of people around who would know the nature of the Last Supper. So people at that time would know if it's a Passover meal or not. So this is an extremely strange contradiction or apparent contradiction in the gospel. So that's the first problem. And when I started thinking about this, I should say that about half scholars believed in the synoptic gospels, saying it was a Passover meal, and the other half said it was before the Passover meal. And if you look at churches, when they celebrate the Last Supper, about half of them use unleavened bread, and the other half use leavened bread. And that's because they believe, you know, it was either a Passover meal or it wasn't a Passover meal. So it's a significant problem in the Gospels. This is the second puzzle, which I call the lost day of Jesus. And this is the Wednesday before the Friday crucifixion. And when biblical scholars try to look at the Gospels, and write down what happened on each day in the last week of Jesus, they find that nothing seems to be written about Wednesday. And this is what the New International Version Study Bible says about Wednesday. It says, Day of Rest Wednesday, not mentioned in the Gospels. The counting of the days seem to indicate that the Gospels record nothing. And this is just highly unusual because on the other days, Jesus is very active. And you can imagine if it's your last week, you know you're going to die at the end of the week. Every day you'll make maximum use of. And so for Jesus to rest on a Wednesday when the Sabbath was a Friday, and it not to be recorded in the Gospels is just curious and strange. So that's a sort of a rather strange mystery. This is a third problem, and that is the lack of time between the Last Supper and the Crucifixion for all the events the Gospels record. So I went through the Gospels recording all the events between the Last Supper on a Thursday evening and the Crucifixion on a Friday morning at 9 a.m. And there are 28 events, and some of them involve being tried before Herod, been tried before Pilate, been tried before Herod. No, it's actually the other way around. Been tried before Pilate, sends him to Herod, then back to Pilate. And they're in different buildings, these people. And a number of the events are in different buildings. And people have gone around Jerusalem with a stopwatch trying to fit them all in. And many have concluded it's impossible. So that's a potential problem. And this is a fourth problem. And this is a question that Jewish scholars have made quite a lot out of, which is important. And this is, if you go to the Mishnah, which was written in about 200 AD, but we know a lot of what it said applied to earlier years, and that is that the Sanhedrin in capital cases had to meet on one day, and they confirmed their decision the next day. So, in many ways, it's a very good legal system because they'd say someone was guilty of death, and then they'd sleep on that decision, and they could revise it the next day if they were worried about it. And also, the Sanhedrin could only meet in the daytime. Now, if the Last Supper was on a Thursday evening and the crucifixion was at 9 o'clock on Friday morning, then the Sanhedrin must have met at night time. And also, they couldn't have met one day and confirmed their decision the next day. So this would be blatantly against the Jewish tradition as recorded in the Mishnah. And the Gospels, though, they say that many false witnesses were called, but nowhere do they even hint that the trials were illegal. The Gospels implicitly seem to accept the legality of the trials. So these are four significant problems about the last week of Jesus. So are the Passion narratives filled with discrepancies? This is a quote from Geisha Vermesh, who's a very distinguished Jewish scholar, and he says that the four Gospels are neither simple or coherent. On the contrary, they are filled with discrepancies. And so my thinking about that was that maybe it's right. Maybe these discrepancies are all very real. Or is it possible that we are failing to understand the Gospels because of our lack of knowledge of life in the 1st century AD? And I'd go further than that. I would say that I think, is it possible the Gospels are actually fairly simple and coherent? And again, we're just misunderstanding because of our knowledge of what things were like in the 1st century AD. So a key question is, do the four Gospels in fact agree, or are they filled with discrepancies? So I took what I think was a new approach to this, multidisciplinary. So looked at the New Testament, looked at the Hebrew Bible, looked at Jewish writings, I looked at Roman writings, I looked at ancient Egypt, evidence from there. And what was particularly new was bringing in astronomy and ancient calendars. And it actually took me 20 years to solve, I think, this problem to my satisfaction, because I went down lots of blind alleyways and then came back and started again. And it's quite a detailed story. I need about 5 hours to put in all the details, but I'm going to include the key details, of course, in this talk. So, reconstruct the last week of Jesus. The key date is the date of the crucifixion. So I'm going to look at the first clues, which are broad clues, which have a lot of confidence in, and then home in on smaller and smaller clues. So it's just as a detective would in, say, a murder investigation. So these are the first clues which give us the broad time span for the crucifixion. This first one is from Tacitus, a famous Roman historian, certainly not a Christian. And there are those people who said Jesus never existed. Well, you really can't say that in the light of what Tacitus says here. Tacitus just says, in a matter-of-fact manner, their originator, that's the Christians' originator, Christ, had been executed in Tiberius' reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. So here's two bits of factual information, calendrical information. Christ died, was executed when Tiberius was emperor, the Roman emperor, and Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea. And then this is another piece of evidence, if it is evidence, from Matthew's Gospel. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest. So Matthew is saying Jesus died when Caiaphas was the high priest. These three people are important people, and their dates were recorded by historians. So we can have considerable confidence in the dates of Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, and Caiaphas, and these are their dates. So we know from Roman literature, Tiberius reigned from AD 14 to 37. We know that Pilate was governor of Judea from AD 26 to 36. That extended a few months into AD 37 as well. And Caiaphas was high priest from AD 18 to 36. So those three pieces of, if we take them to be evidence, then all three had to be satisfied for when Jesus was crucified. So the earliest possible date is AD 26, because let's say if we take, let me get my pointer. If we say Jesus was crucified by AD 14, well, it couldn't have been, because the other evidence says that he was crucified in AD 26 or AD 18 here. So the earliest date for him to be crucified was AD 26. The latest date is AD 36. So Jesus was crucified in this 10-year period. This first bits of key information. And I put nearly all scholars agree. I mean, I think something like, 98% of scholars agree, and the other ones are sort of rather unusual characters who are probably who don't believe in evidence anyway. So, but the other thing is the evidence from the Gospels agree. The evidence from the Gospel here, the Caiaphas of high priest, if we go back, the evidence from Matthew's Gospel about Caiaphas being high priest, that fits the evidence of the other two, right? So those dates are consistent with these dates. And if you put them all together, crucifixion was in the period AD 26 to 36. So we have a consistent story there between the Gospels and external evidence as well. So the date of the crucifixion itself, a New Testament scholar called Joseph Blinzer has looked at the publications of over 100 biblical scholars, and he's found all these dates have been suggested in AD 26 to 36. I think the only year missing is AD 35, right? All these other dates have been suggested. The most popular date, AD 29 was suggested by 13 scholars, AD 30 by 53 scholars, so that's the most popular date, AD 33 by 24 scholars. And recently a date of AD 21 was suggested, but that has to be untrue, because it has to be between 26 and 36, so it's so well-established dates. So within this broad range, AD 26 to 36, there's huge uncertainty amongst modern biblical scholars. What about the earliest known date for the crucifixion? The earliest known date we can find is from a Christian called Tertullian, a Christian scholar called Tertullian, and he was writing about AD 200, and he says the crucifixion date was 25th of March, AD 29. We can reject that for scientific reasons, because we can do the astronomical calculations. So just as astronomy can predict future eclipses, for example, so it can predict past eclipses. So you wind the equation to predict future eclipses, you, as it were, wind the equations of motion of the sun, moon, and earth forwards. Past ones, you wind them backwards. And if we wind them backwards, we know that the Passover moon in AD 29 was in April and not in March. So we know Tertullian was wrong. But if you then say what Tertullian actually says, he actually says, I believe it was 25th of March, AD 29, but he adds, it's not accepted everywhere throughout the church. So that's an honest statement. And what he's saying is, in AD 200, Christians at that time, they were arguing even then at AD 200 about the date of the crucifixion. So this is an unknown date that's been discussed and argued about for about 2,000 years. So it's a huge length of time this problem has existed and not been solved. So let's look at a few more clues. The day of the crucifixion, all four Gospels say it was Friday, and all early Christian literature says it's Friday. I'm aware that some people say crucifixion was on Wednesday or Thursday, and I don't have time to go into that, but those arguments are all weak by comparison. The Friday is just very strong in all four Gospels and early Christian literature. And here's an example from Mark's Gospel. Mark says it was preparation day, and Mark adds, that is the day before the Sabbath. The Jewish Sabbath on a Saturday, so the day before is a Friday. And similar statements in all four Gospels and in all early Christian literature. What about the time Jesus died? Matthew is very specific, says he died about the 9th hour. Well, what does this mean? So the Jewish day, the official Jewish day and the official Jewish calendar started at sunset, but they measure their hours of daylight from sunrise. So it's a bit like we use both a 24-hour calendar and a 12-hour calendar, or 12-hour clock rather than a 24-hour clock, and they did the same. So sunrise in Jerusalem at Passover time is about 6 a.m. Again, we can calculate that from astronomy. And so if you add 9 hours to that, then Jesus dies about 3 p.m. on Friday in the period AD 26 to 36. And that, I think you'll find that, essentially all biblical scholars and historians would agree with that. So we come back to the problem of the Last Supper. Here's F.F. Bruce. It's the thorniest problem in the New Testament. Here's a commentary by Dick France called The Gospel of Mark. The debate has been extremely complex and the issue remains unresolved. So that is a situation where people take sides, but there's no consensus. When I did this work, there was no consensus from biblical scholars about the date and about the resolution of this Last Supper problem. So, okay, what is meant by the date of Passover? And what was it in the 1st century AD? So if we go back to the book of Exodus, there is the first Passover that Moses held, which is described, and it says the lambs were slaughtered at twilight on the 14th day of the 1st month. And then if we come to Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, Josephus tells us about Passover in the 1st century AD, and he says the lambs were slaughtered from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. on Nisan 14. Now, the first month of the year in Exodus was later called Nisan, and it corresponds roughly to our March and April. And so the first month is Nisan 14. And between the first Passover and the 1st century AD, there were many, many more Jews. So many more lambs had to be slaughtered. And what the Jewish priests decided was to bring forward the time of the slaughter. So instead of being able to slaughter at twilight, which is around sunset, they just brought things forward from 3 to 3 p.m. So they were slaughtered between 3 and 5 p.m. And we just note in passing, which we'll come back to later, that the first Passover lambs, according to Josephus, this Jewish historian, were slaughtered at 3 p.m. on Nisan 14. And we may remember that Matthew tells us that Jesus died at 3 p.m. So let's have a look at the Passover meal. The Passover lamb was slaughtered in the late afternoon of Nisan 14. The Passover meal was held after sunset that evening, and that was the start of Nisan 15 because it was a sunset to sunset day. So Passover lamb slaughtered Nisan 14, Passover meal eaten Nisan 15. That was new moon time because Nisan 1 was when you saw the first crescent moon, so it's a new moon on Nisan 1, and then Nisan 15 was full moon time. So we now come back to these discrepancy about the Last Supper. So this is what the Synoptic Gospels say. Mark says, the disciples asked Jesus, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? So this is very clear. The disciples are saying to Jesus, where shall we go for you to eat, well, for you to eat the Passover? And during the meal, Jesus says, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. So Jesus calls the meal a Passover, and neither disciples nor Jesus will be mistaken. So if the and we know the Passover meal was eaten on Nisan 15, right? The Passover lambs are slain, Nisan 14, Passover meal eaten on Nisan 15, and then the crucifixion will be later that Jewish day, right? So the evening of Nisan, there was sunset, then there was the Passover meal after sunset of Nisan 15, and then the night came, and then the day came, and Jesus was crucified at 9 o'clock in the morning that day, and then he died at 3 p.m. in the afternoon that day. So according to the synoptics, the crucifixion was on Nisan 15. This is what John says. John rather pointedly says it was just before the Passover feast, the evening meal was being served. If you read what Jesus said during that evening meal, it is essentially the same as what Jesus said at the Last Supper in the synoptics. So that evening meal of John is the last meal Jesus having with the disciples, and he says it was just before the Passover feast. And it's almost as if it's deliberately putting that. John was the last gospel to be written, almost deliberately pointing that out. And then later in John, chapter 18, after the Passover meal was so after the evening meal was eaten, then Jesus was arrested, went out to the Mount of Olives, he was arrested, taken and tried before Caiaphas. And this is what John says. To avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So the trials of Jesus happened before people had ate the Passover. And if you look in detail at John, John has Jesus dying when the Passover lambs were slain. And the Passover lambs were slain on Nisan 14. So John has the Last Supper. John has the Last Supper after the crucifixion, and it's on Nisan 14. So there is this clear discrepancy between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who say the Last Supper was the Passover meal, and John, who says that the Last Supper was before the Passover meal, and he specifically says that. And John has Jesus being slain on Nisan 14. So how do we interpret this? Well, these are the possible interpretations. We can say the synoptics are correct, and John is wrong, and the crucifixion was on Nisan 15, as the synoptics say. We can say and that's what a number of biblical scholars believe. We can say the synoptics are correct, and John can be interpreted to agree. Some other scholars say that, but you really have to tie yourself in knots to say that, I think. And then you know that they will both agree, but that's not. When you say John can be interpreted to agree, then you really have to twist your interpretation of what John's saying. So basically, synoptics are correct and John is wrong. Or you can say John was correct and the synoptics are wrong. And some people say the Last Supper was a Passover light meal, but I don't think so. Jesus says, I've earnestly longed to eat this Passover before I suffer. So the crucifixion of Nisan 14. So, and then there's a last alternative that both are correct. And the only way both can be correct, in my opinion, is you can say John's correct and then synoptics correct if they're using a different calendar. And if that's the case, you can have them both being correct, because if it's a different calendar, then Nisan 14 is actually on a different day from Nisan 14 in the what's called the correct calendar. By the correct calendar, I mean the calendar used by the priests of the temples. But basically we have four possible interpretations of the Last Supper. And the question is, synoptics can be correct or John can be correct. And the synoptics may be correct if they use a different calendar. So what we can say, though, with some certainty, is that the the date of the crucifixion was on either Nisan 14, 15, or 14. So we're going to say we'll take those possibilities both into account because we don't know. At the present stage, we don't know if the crucifixion was Nisan 14. We believe it's either those 2 days, and we're not sure which one. So this then allows us to make a clear sort of statement, and we can say what we do know is the crucifixion was in the date range AD 26 to 36, it was on a Friday, and it was on either Nisan 14 or 15. And then we can say, ask the question, in what years did Nisan 14 or 15 fall on a Friday in the period AD 26 to 36? Let me just update that briefly, which may be helpful. So let's say a person's had their grandfather die, and they're just recovering some papers from around that time, and they want to find out the year in which the grandfather died. And they find in the papers that he must have died in the period 1926 to 1936, and other papers tell them that he died on a Friday, and then some other papers tell them he died in April, and it could have been April 14 or 15. And so you can combine these bits of information, and they can look at their grandfather and say, in what years did April 14 or 15 fall on a Friday in the period 1926 to 1936? And that's an easy thing to solve because you go onto the internet and you can find the calendars for the 10-year period. So you can look at 1926, you can say 1926, did April 14 or 15 fall on a Friday or not? And your answer's either yes or no, it did fall on a Friday or it didn't fall on a Friday. And then you can say, if it didn't fall on a Friday, then 1926 could not have been the year of his death. And so we can do the same thing for AD 26 to 36 and the death of Jesus, except that we do not have a recorded calendar for that period. So we have no historical records of the Jewish calendar from AD 26 to 36. So what we did was not new, because other people had tried this before, but we used more accurate calculations than other people had used. And it's only in the last 50 years that we can go back 2,000 years and take into account variations in the rate of rotation of the moon around the Earth and the Earth around the sun. So if you go back, sometime, people thought that the moon went round the Earth uniformly, and we now know that's not true. And there's various reasons. One is called tidal friction. So when the moon goes around the Earth, it creates tides, and the tides go in and out, and there's friction on the sand that takes energy, and so things are slowing up basically. And then another factor is the Earth itself revolving once every 24 hours, and the polar ice caps are melting now because of global warming, and that changes what's called the moment of inertia of the Earth, and so that changes what's called the angular momentum of the Earth. So we now know that very precisely, and so Graham Waddington used the latest calculations, which we've only used known for about the last 50 years. And what he did, he calculated the first day of each month in the period AD 26 to 36, and the first day of the month of Nisan in particular. And this is the evening when the new moon crescent, the crescent of the new moon was first visible. The other factor, which you need to know, is the mean time between new moons is 29.53 days. So each lunar month is either 29 or 30 days long. There's no lunar month which is 31 days long. Past calculations not very accurate. Calculations of Graham Waddington, we checked against over 1,000 recorded observations of the new moon, and going back in time, and Graham's calculations gave the correct answer every time. So we have a lot of confidence in them. But there's still some problems, even though we have confidence in the calculations. And one problem is this: 12 lunar months are about 354 days. A solar year is about 365 days. So it's a discrepancy of 11 days between a lunar year and a solar year. And the Jews wanted their lunar calendar to keep in step with the solar year for agricultural and religious reasons. One reason was this religious reason that the lambs have to be killed on Nisan 14. And so the lambs have to be ready to be killed on Nisan 14. They mustn't be sheep, they must be newborn lambs, but not too small. And so that's one reason for keeping in step with the solar year. And another reason is that on Nisan 16, there's what's called a first fruits festival in the Bible, and it's the first fruits of barley. And what happens on Nisan 16 is the priests of the temple go into the barley fields and cut off the sheaves of barley, and they bring them back to the temple, and they wave them in the temple. It's called waving the sheaf, and then the barley harvest can begin. But before the priests have waved the sheaves in the temple, the barley harvest can't start. And so if you get the date, if you're out of step with the solar year, there's either no sheaves of no barley to wave in the fields, or the harvest is essentially over if you get it wrong the other way, and so the harvest is lost. So for those reasons, an extra year was added. Yeah, sorry. For those reasons, an extra month was added approximately once every 3 years. And they had an equation for doing this. And the equation was determined, and the decision made by the Sanhedrin, that Passover must fall after the spring equinox. So the spring equinox is when the length of the day equals the length of the night, and we can calculate that now, of course. And so we can take that into account. We can reconstruct the calendar, adding extra months so that Passover always falls after the spring equinox. But the priests were actually very clever, and they realized that in exceptionally cold winter, the crops and lambs would be delayed, and that would be a disaster. And so they had the power to add an extra month, right? They could just say, we believe the lambs won't be ready, we believe the crops won't be ready, we're going to add an extra month. And so they had the power to do that. And we have records of some years they did this, but we have no records for AD 26 to 36. And so what Graham Waddington did was to reconstruct the calendar for AD 26 to 36, and he then reconstructed again on the assumption that the priest had added an extra month that year. And so he took into account all possibilities. And I've often wished, when meeting a deadline for a conference paper or something, to be able to decree an extra month was a great thing to be able to do. So and the priest had that power. So what Graham Waddington did, he computed the date, Nisan 1, where the new crescent moon was first visible in the evening sky for this period AD 26 to 36. He then just went from Nisan 1 to Nisan 14 and 15 and determined when Nisan 14 and 15 fell on a Friday in that year. And then he recalculated each year, taking into account the priest may have decreed an extra month. And then he did something else. He recalculated each month to take into account it was a cloudy sky, because the Jewish calendar was an observational calendar. And we know from their records, if it was a cloudy sky, they waited until the next day. That was if the cloudy sky was on the 29th of the month, they then waited to the 30th month. They didn't wait any longer because they knew a month couldn't be more than 30 days long. So basically we covered all avenues in what we did. So, and this is the result of his calculations. Nisan 14 was on the Friday fell on Nisan 14. On the 11th of April AD 27, the 7th of April AD 30, the 3rd of April AD 33. Nisan 15 was on a Friday. On the 11th of April AD 27, on the 26th of March AD 34, and on the 23rd of April AD 33. If you are still awake, you will notice that 11 April AD 27 appears twice in these dates. And the reason for that is that the calculations show we cannot be certain, because the crescent moon was so thin that we cannot be certain if the crescent moon would have been seen on 11 April AD 27, and that was Nisan 14, or on Nisan 15. We cannot be certain up to within a day. And so we included both possibilities. If the atmosphere was exceptionally transparent, you see it on one day. If it's, normally transparent, you see it on the other day. So we included both possibilities there. And then If you look at the bottom of the table, 26 March AD 34, 23 April AD 4, that's if the priests, those two dates arise if the priests had decreed an extra month. And we don't know if they did or not. So that gives rise to those dates. So that's something which arises from the main clues that we have. So can we look at minor clues now? So Luke starts the third chapter of his gospel. He tells us when John the Baptist started his ministry, he said it was in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. I mean, it's a curiosity that we know when John the Baptist started his ministry, but Luke makes no similar statement of the precision of when Jesus started his ministry. It was interesting. Anyway, so Luke tells us when John the Baptist started his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. Unfortunately, Luke doesn't tell us what calendar he was using. So there are three possibilities. He was either using the civil calendar of the Jews, which started in the autumn, or the lunar calendar of the Jews, which started in the spring, or a Roman calendar. If he was using the civil calendar of Jews, which started in autumn, then John the Baptist started his ministry in AD 28 to 29. If I find my little pointer. Or if it was the Roman calendar, AD 29, or if it was the spring calendar, AD 29 to 30. But either way, AD 27 is too early for the crucifixion because John the Baptist baptized Jesus. So if John started in AD 28, AD 27 is too early for the crucifixion. We know from Paul's conversion, we can work out from later dates, which we know of Paul's ministry, that the latest date for Paul's conversion was AD 34. So AD 34 is too late for the crucifixion. So AD 27 is too early, AD 34 too late. We go back to this table and we look at the bottom of the table, Nisan 15. We rule out AD 27, we rule out AD 34. So Nisan 15 is not a possible date for the crucifixion if you accept all this evidence. And so the crucifixion has to be on Nisan 14. So John's chronology is right, and the Synoptics chronology is right if they were using a different calendar. But the Synoptics chronology is otherwise not correct. So we have those two dates are the only possible dates for the crucifixion. Both dates are Friday, Nisan 14 for the crucifixion. And that goes through what I just said before. So of these bullet points, the only one which fits the evidence is that John is correct, and the synoptics can be correct if they're using a different calendar. And that's the only possibilities. So we can say that the Last Supper cannot have been a Passover meal held at official time. And so we've used science essentially to distinguish between different theological interpretations. But then we get other evidence we can bring in. So this is what Paul says. Paul says, Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. Now, Paul was a great scholar, and he's making a clear analogy with the sacrifice of Christ and the Passover sacrifice. And I think Paul would not have done this if it was a day out, right? He wouldn't have used this analogy of a day out. So he's saying essentially Christ was sacrificed. Well, Christ is saying, knowing that Christ was sacrificed on Nisan 14, which is then Passover sacrifice, he says Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. So that's consistent with our crucifixion on Nisan 14. Paul then goes on to say, Christ had been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Christ was raised from the dead. If the crucifixion was Nisan 14, the Friday, then Nisan 15 was Saturday, Nisan 16 was a Sunday. The Sunday, we know from the Old Testament, was when the first fruits of the barley harvest was waved in the temple. And Paul is making this analogy. He's saying that Christ was like the first fruits of the barley harvest, that until that was done, other people, the harvest couldn't be held. And it was the crucifixion of Christ, which enabled other people to rise from the dead. He was the first fruits of those rise from the dead. And so this is a clear analogy again that the resurrection was on Nisan 16, when the barley first fruits festival was Nisan 16. So Paul's making these very clear analogies with what he knew from the Hebrew Bible, and the symbolism is consistent with crucifixion Nisan 14, not consistent with Nisan 15. And then if we look at various other apocryphal books, for example, this is the apocryphal Gospel of Peter, who says Jesus' death was on the eve of Passover. So the eve of the Passover feast was Nisan 14. And I should say, I put timing in there, exclamation mark. If what we're saying is true, and it agrees with all this symbolism where Jesus is called the Lamb of God, it's right, the Lamb of God, and right through to the Lamb being sacrificed. Then it's either a remarkable coincidence that Christ died at the time the Passover lambs were slain, and actually at 3 p.m. at the time the first Passover lambs were slain, also a piece of remarkable timing. And it's pretty difficult for someone to get themselves killed. I mean, you can commit suicide, on a particular date, but to actually get other people to kill you on a particular date is remarkable timing in a way. But God sort of arranged this so that Christ was analogous to the Passover lambs, who then took in the Old Testament, who took away the sins of the people. So it's really remarkable timing. And here's a few more references. This is the Babylonian Talmud, a Jewish document, which says on the eve of Passover, they're hanging Yeshu. Earlier, it was called Yeshu the Nazarene, so it's a reference to Jesus. So these are all the evidence, piece of evidence we have. And there's a unanimity that crucifixion was on Nisan 15 on the eve of the Passover feast, but when the Passover lambs were slain. And there's no evidence against it that I know. So all the evidence is consistent with this, and I know no evidence against it. So we have these two possible dates for the crucifixion. Can we use any more evidence to get home in on one of these? And I think we can. So we go back to when John the Baptist started his ministry, and the earliest date was autumn AD 28, and John the Baptist baptized Jesus. So Jesus couldn't have started before autumn AD 28. And John's Gospel records 3 Passovers in the ministry of Jesus. And so the first Passover, the earliest would have been AD 29, and then the next one AD 30, and the next one AD 31. So that rules out an AD 30 crucifixion date. And there's a rather curious reference in the second chapter of John, and this was at the first Passover of Jesus that John records, and Jesus says, no, I think the Jews say to Jesus, it's taken 46 years to build this temple. And at first sight, that's an odd thing to say because the temple was built by, gosh, I think this is Solomon. But anyway, I think, gosh, I think this is anyway, odd thing to say. They're solid. I mean, it's built many more years than 46 years earlier. So I think this is Solomon's temple, right? But it's so what does it mean? Well, in fact, when the Bible translates this temple, the Greek word used is naos, and naos is a specific word which refers to the inner court of the temple. It's the holiest of holiest places. And Josephus tells us that Herod had rebuilt Naos, and he tells us when it was, the date. And if you add 46 years to the date in Josephus for when King Herod rebuilt the Naos, it leads you to AD 30 or 31. And that occurred in the first Passover of Jesus' ministry. So that rules out an AD 30 crucifixion date. So these two sort of minor clues both ruled out an AD 30 crucifixion date. And so if you go back, we're left with just one date for the crucifixion, 3rd of April, AD 33. So all the evidence, I think, fits one and only one date. That Jesus died Friday, 3rd of April, AD 33 at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And again, I know of no evidence against this. So all the evidence actually points, so there is a consistent story. And so this was published in Nature, which is a very famous science journal. It's some people say it's certainly one of the leading science journals in the world. And I sent it off for publication there because I thought it was of general interest, but also because of the astronomy in it. And it was published in 1983 in Nature. And there was an interesting story about that. And that is, it went to the physics editor of Nature. And unusually, he told me that we had 4 referees, and most papers only have 2 referees. And he actually sent me those reports because he had a big argument with John Maddox over this paper. And John Maddox was the overall editor of Nature. So he had 4 referees. 2 were astronomers and very eminent astronomers. One was a bishop of Birmingham, someone called Hugh Montefiore, and the other was a very famous biblical chronologist. So these are really, and he said he'd rarely seen such referees' reports, which essentially said you must publish this paper because it's of fundamental importance to history. So what happened was that he also chose what happens in Nature. One of the best papers in that edition of Nature, that the cover of Nature has an illustration to illustrate this paper and draw attention to it. And so this physics editor had chosen a stained glass window with a crucifixion in the stained glass window as a cover of Nature. And John Maddox was then the editor of Nature, and he was an atheist, but rather militant atheist. And I've got lots of friends who are atheists, but I know John Maddox quite well after this event. But John Maddox was apparently furious, and he said, "You cannot publish this paper in Nature." And he tried to stop it, and he couldn't stop it because it had gone too fast. It had gone before, after the proof stage. So, all the other papers were there. This was all there in order. But he managed to stop the cover, and the cover of Nature for this particular edition just has some birds flying in the sky, and it's a very innocuous sort of cover. And then Maddox was very personally involved in this afterwards, and so the paper was published, and there was tremendous correspondence to Nature about it. And John Maddox would send me, a letter that he'd received, the first letter he received, and it was highly critical of the paper. And John Maddox said, "I'm enclosing this letter. It destroys your paper." And Graham Waddington and myself, showed that in fact this letter was wrong. And we replied back and said, no, this letter you've been sent is wrong for the following reasons. And then next day send us another letter. "This destroys your paper." And so we sent our rebuttals back. And I said to John Maddox, I said, "Are you going to publish these letters plus our rebuttals?" And John Maddox said, "Yes, I'm going to publish 4 pages of these criticisms," because he said that these criticisms taken together would destroy your paper. And that never happened. I mean, all the criticisms we had, and they're mainly scientific criticism for the astronomy. We showed that in fact it was wrong, and this paper, was valid, and the science was valid. So that's an interesting story that John Maddox actually tried to stop it, but it was too late, and so and there's been a huge number of downloads of that paper. And so now, this stage of the crucifixion, this was one of the possible dates previously, but not the most popular date, and now it is. So this crucifixion date is now widely accepted, and biblical commentaries refer to it. And what's interesting is there are various international groups which have arisen, and they plan to celebrate the 2,000-year anniversary of the resurrection. So the crucifixion on 3rd of April, resurrection on 5th of April. And there's international plans to celebrate the resurrection 2,000-year anniversary on the 5th of April, 2023. So those events are happening. So it has been widely adopted, and I'm obviously biased, but I think the data has to be correct because all the evidence accords with it. So in the next talk, The next talk will be easier to understand, maybe, because I know a lot of this is quite detailed argument. The next talk is going to be much more dramatic in a way, because there's a key question, which we actually put in our Nature paper as well, that there's evidence that there was a lunar eclipse on the evening of the crucifixion when the moon turned blood red. And you may know in England recently there was a lunar eclipse which got some publicity, and it's called a blood moon. And so I'm going to talk about that in the next talk. And also in the next talk, I'm going to talk about this different calendar theory. And I'm going to identify what I believe the different calendar was and give some evidence for that. So that's the next talk, which I think is tomorrow. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening, because I know it's you have to listen quite intently to the various bits of evidence. So thank you very much.